I sat in my car 2 blocks from my own house, staring down the quiet street like it might confess something if I looked at it long enough. The engine had been off for almost an hour, and the ticking metal of the cooling hood echoed softly in the silence. It had been exactly 47 minutes since I kissed my wife goodbye at the front door, rolled my suitcase down the walkway, and told her I'd call when my flight landed in Chicago. I even did the whole routine properly, like a man who had nothing to worry about. I hugged her, joked about airport food, complained about the airline delays we both knew were coming. If anyone had been watching, it would have looked completely normal. But nothing about that morning had felt normal to me. My suitcase was still sitting in the passenger seat. Inside, it wasn't clothes for a 3-day conference. It was a camera charger, a notebook, and the same folder of financial papers I'd been staring at for weeks, trying to understand why something about them made my stomach twist every time I opened them. Across the street from my house, the neighborhood looked exactly like it always did on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Lawns trimmed, mailboxes leaning slightly in the sun. The faint smell of someone grilling drifted through the open window of my car, mixing with the bitter taste of the coffee that had long since gone cold in the cup holder. Everything looked peaceful enough to make me feel ridiculous for sitting there like some paranoid detective in a cheap crime movie. For the first 30 minutes after I left the house, I kept telling myself I was going to start the car and drive to the airport like I originally planned. I even picked up my phone twice to check flight prices, trying to convince myself that whatever suspicion had crept into my mind over the past month was just stress. Marriage does strange things to your imagination sometimes. People work late. People forget to mention things. People lock their phones because everyone locks their phones now. Except my wife never used to. And that was the first tiny crack that started this whole thing. 48 minutes. I checked the dashboard clock again and leaned forward slightly in my seat. From where I was parked, I could see just enough of my driveway through the gap between 2 trees. Not clearly, just enough to notice movement. For a long time there wasn't any. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from my wife. "Did you get to the airport yet?" I stared at the screen for a few seconds before replying. "Almost there. Traffic is awful." 3 dots appeared almost instantly as she started typing again. "Okay. Text me when you land. Love you." I read the message twice before locking the phone and setting it back in the cup holder. The strange thing was that nothing about her text sounded suspicious. It sounded exactly like every other message she had ever sent me before a trip, which made the feeling in my chest even harder to explain. Because the suspicion hadn't started with messages. It started with something much smaller. A smell. 3 weeks earlier, I came home late from the office, tired and half distracted, and the moment I stepped into the hallway, I caught the faint scent of cologne hanging in the air. Not mine. Something sharper, woodier. The kind of scent you only notice if you're already looking for something out of place. At the time, I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe one of the neighbors stopped by. Maybe I walked through it somewhere outside without realizing. Except the smell was strongest near our bedroom door. And that night when I checked the laundry basket, there was a shirt of mine missing. Not a random one either. My dark blue button-down. The one I only wore to important meetings. The one that, strangely enough, I noticed someone had borrowed cologne on a few days later when it magically reappeared in the closet. At the time, I laughed it off. But then other things started stacking up behind it. The locked phone. The sudden gym sessions, the refinancing paperwork she insisted we signed 2 weeks ago that I barely glanced at, and the one detail that kept replaying in my mind every time I tried to ignore all of it. The Wi-Fi network logs. Because late one night, out of pure curiosity more than anything else, I checked the list of devices that had connected to our home network that week. Most of them were exactly what you'd expect. My laptop, her phone, the smart TV. But there was one device that kept appearing in the logs during the exact hours I was usually still at work. Same device, same time, every few days. And the strange thing was that the network didn't just show a device ID. It showed the device name. I didn't recognize it at first, but when I Googled it, the answer made my chest tighten. It was a phone. And the name attached to that phone belonged to someone I trusted. The thought still made my jaw clench even now as I sat there watching the house. 51 minutes. Still nothing. Maybe I really was insane. Maybe this entire plan was about to end with me sneaking back into my own house like a criminal just to discover my wife sitting on the couch watching Netflix. I leaned back in the seat and exhaled slowly. Then something moved. At first it was just a flicker of motion near the driveway. A second later I heard it. The low mechanical rumble of the garage door motor starting up. I sat up straight immediately. The garage door slowly lifted, sunlight spilling across the concrete floor inside. For a moment I told myself, maybe she was just taking the car somewhere. Maybe everything I suspected was about to fall apart in the most embarrassing way possible. Then someone walked out into the garage. Not my wife. A man. He stepped into the light casually, like he had been inside the house for a while. And the moment I recognized his face, my entire body went cold. Because the man walking out of my garage was someone I trusted more than almost anyone in my life. And the worst part was, he had been standing beside me at my wedding. When I saw him step out of my garage that afternoon, the first thing I felt wasn't rage or heartbreak or even shock, but something colder and quieter that settled into my chest, like a stone sinking to the bottom of deep water. Because the man walking casually toward the passenger side of the car parked in my driveway was not some stranger sneaking out of my house while I was supposedly boarding a plane. It was Daniel, my business partner, the guy who had stood next to me in a rented tuxedo 7 years earlier while I nervously waited at the altar for my wife to walk down the aisle. The same guy who toasted our marriage that night and joked that if anything ever happened between us, he was claiming half the bar tab we ran up at the reception. I remember sitting frozen in the driver's seat while he opened the car door and leaned inside for a moment, like he was looking for something. From where I was parked, I couldn't see my front door directly, only the driveway and the garage. But that was enough. Enough to make the pieces inside my head start clicking together in ways I had tried very hard to avoid over the past month. Daniel had been coming over to the house more often lately. At least that was the excuse I had given myself whenever my wife mentioned it casually in conversation. Daniel stopped by earlier to drop off some paperwork, she had said once while we were eating dinner. Another time she mentioned he had swung by to return a set of golf clubs he borrowed months ago. I didn't question it because Daniel and I ran a consulting firm together. It wasn't unusual for him to stop by if we were working on a proposal or reviewing client numbers. Except those visits had always happened while I was home. Until recently. In the driveway now, Daniel closed the car door and glanced briefly toward the house like he was waiting for someone. My heart started beating faster, even though I tried to tell myself there could still be a reasonable explanation. Maybe my wife had asked him to look at something around the house. Maybe he had just dropped off documents. Then the front door opened. My wife stepped outside. She wasn't dressed like someone spending a quiet afternoon at home. She wore the black dress she usually saved for dinner parties, the one that fell just above her knees and made strangers at restaurants turn their heads when we walked past their tables. Her hair was pulled back loosely, and even from across the street I could see the way she was smiling at him. The smile didn't look like the one she gave me that morning when I left with the suitcase. It was different, relaxed, familiar. Daniel said something I couldn't hear, and she laughed before lightly touching his arm in a way that made my stomach tighten instantly. I had seen that gesture 1,000 times during our marriage, and I knew exactly what it meant even from a distance. People like to pretend body language is complicated. It isn't. Not when you've lived beside someone long enough to recognize the difference between polite conversation and something else entirely. For a moment, I actually reached for the door handle of my car. The instinct to confront them hit me so suddenly that my hand was already halfway there before I stopped myself. I imagined walking across the street, standing in the driveway while they both turned toward me with those guilty expressions people always have in movies. I imagined Daniel stuttering through some excuse while my wife tried to act confused about why I was suddenly back from the airport. But something stopped me. Not fear. Something smarter. Because the truth was that if I walked across that street right now, all I would have was suspicion and anger. They would deny everything. They would say Daniel had just stopped by to discuss work, and technically that wouldn't even be a lie. What I needed wasn't a confrontation. What I needed was proof. Across the street, Daniel walked around the car and slid into the driver's seat. My wife leaned down toward the window and said something that made him grin before she stepped back toward the garage. Then the car pulled out of the driveway and drove past my parked vehicle without either of them noticing me sitting there. As the car disappeared around the corner, I leaned back in my seat and exhaled slowly, because suddenly the Wi-Fi logs from 3 weeks earlier made perfect sense. Daniel's phone, connecting to my home network, every few days, during the exact hours I was still at the office. I watched my house for another few minutes before starting the engine again. The strange thing was that instead of feeling emotional or impulsive, my mind felt unusually calm, like a puzzle finally revealing its shape. Because if Daniel had been visiting the house while I was gone, then there was a very good chance those visits had been happening for longer than I realized, which meant there was only one way to know for sure. That night, after my wife fell asleep beside me, I opened my laptop and logged into the router history again, and what I saw there made my stomach drop. Because Daniel's phone hadn't just connected to my network a few times, it had connected 16 different times in the past 2 months. And the strange part wasn't the number of visits, it was the pattern. Every single time his phone connected, it happened on a day when I stayed late at the office, except for one. One visit happened at a time that made absolutely no sense, and when I checked the date more carefully, I realized something that made the room suddenly feel very small, because that visit had happened on a day when I was supposed to be home the entire evening, which meant only one thing. That day, I had left the house for exactly 40 minutes, and when I came back, something in the bedroom had smelled like cologne. The moment I realized Daniel's phone had connected to my home network on a day I had only been gone for 40 minutes, something inside my head shifted from suspicion to strategy, because coincidences have a strange way of disappearing when you start lining them up next to actual timestamps. I sat there at the kitchen table long after midnight, the glow from my laptop lighting the room while my wife slept upstairs, completely unaware that the quiet life we had built together was slowly being dismantled line by a router log most people would never bother to check. The timestamp on the screen read 6:18 p.m. That was the exact moment Daniel's phone connected to the network. I leaned back in my chair and tried to remember that evening. It hadn't seemed important at the time, just another normal weekday. But the more I thought about it, the clearer the memory became. That was the night I ran out to pick up takeout. I had left the house around 6, driven 10 minutes to a Thai place down the street, and come back home with 2 bags of food balanced awkwardly in one arm while I fumbled with the door handle. 40 minutes, maybe less. At the time, nothing looked unusual when I walked in. My wife had been sitting on the couch watching TV. Dinner plates were already on the table. She even joked that I took so long the noodles probably went cold. But there had been one detail that stuck in my mind even now: the smell. That sharp, woody cologne that lingered faintly in the hallway near our bedroom. At the time, I told myself maybe it was coming from the hallway closet where I kept my suits. But the more I replayed the memory, the less that explanation made sense. Because that scent didn't belong to any cologne I owned. And now I knew something else. Daniel wore that exact kind of cologne. I closed the laptop slowly and rubbed my eyes. The house was silent except for the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of the television upstairs where my wife had fallen asleep watching something earlier. For the first time since the suspicion started, the situation felt real in a way that was impossible to ignore. Daniel hadn't just visited my house when I was at work. He had been inside my home when I was only minutes away. Close enough to come back unexpectedly. Close enough that he could have still been inside when I walked through the front door. The thought made my stomach tighten. Because if that was true, then one question immediately followed it. Where had he gone in those 40 minutes? I pushed the chair back from the table and walked quietly into the hallway. The faint smell of lavender drifted down the stairs from our bedroom. My wife always used the same lotion before bed. It had been one of those little things about her I used to find comforting, Now it felt strangely distant. I stood there for a moment listening to the silence of the house. Then I walked toward the living room. There was something else I wanted to check. 2 years earlier, we installed a smart security system after a series of car break-ins happened around the neighborhood. It wasn't anything fancy, just a few cameras facing the driveway and the front door, mostly for peace of mind. At the time, I never imagined I'd be reviewing the footage from inside my own house looking for signs of betrayal. I opened the security app on my phone, scrolled back through the recorded days, found the date, 6:03 p.m., motion detected, front driveway. My thumb hesitated above the video. Then I tapped play. The footage appeared instantly, grainy but clear enough. At exactly 6:03 p.m., my car backed out of the driveway and disappeared down the street. I fast-forwarded slightly. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the timestamp changed. 6:16 p.m., motion detected. A car pulled slowly into the driveway. Not mine. Daniel's. I watched the video without blinking as he stepped out of the car, walked casually to the front door, and knocked once. The door opened almost immediately. My wife stood there, smiling. She stepped aside and let him inside like it was the most normal thing in the world. The timestamp ticked forward. 6:17, 6:18. The door closed. I leaned closer to the screen, because there was one more motion alert later that evening. The next clip started at 6:41 p.m. The front door opened again. Daniel stepped outside quickly, adjusting his shirt as he walked toward the driveway. My heart began beating faster, because behind him, standing just inside the doorway, my wife reached forward and grabbed his arm. She pulled him back slightly, said something I couldn't hear. Then she leaned up and kissed him. Not a quick goodbye kiss. Not the kind people give casually. The kind that leaves no room for misunderstanding. Daniel laughed softly afterward and walked down the driveway toward his car. He drove away at exactly 6:43 p.m. 3 minutes later, the next clip appeared. My car pulling back into the driveway. I sat there staring at the screen for a long time, because suddenly that strange moment from weeks earlier made terrifying sense. When I walked into the house that night, my wife had already closed the door behind him, and the cologne I smelled in the hallway wasn't imagination. It was the scent of a man who had just left my bedroom. I locked the phone and placed it slowly on the table. For a few seconds, I felt something close to rage building in my chest, but then it faded, because anger would only help them. Evidence would help me. And now I had my first real piece of it. The next morning, my wife kissed me goodbye before I left for work. "Don't forget," she said casually while pouring coffee. "Daniel might stop by later about the client proposal." I smiled back at her. "Tell him I said hi." She smiled too, but there was something in that smile that felt different now. Like I was watching a performance instead of a conversation. And the strangest part was that she had no idea I had already seen everything, which meant I had time to collect more evidence, time to understand exactly what they were planning, and time to make sure that when the truth finally came out, they wouldn't see it coming. That afternoon, I ordered 3 small devices online, hidden cameras, motion activated, the kind that looked like ordinary phone chargers, because if Daniel had already visited my house 16 times, there was only one question left. What exactly were they doing when they thought I wasn't watching? The cameras arrived 2 days later in a plain brown box that looked so ordinary it almost felt insulting considering what I planned to use them for. I opened the package in the garage before bringing it inside, carefully slicing through the tape while the quiet hum of the overhead light buzzed faintly above me. 3 devices sat inside the box, each no bigger than a phone charger, designed to plug into a wall outlet and quietly record everything in front of them without drawing attention. If someone didn't know what they were looking at, they would never think twice about them. That was the entire point. I stood there for a moment, turning one of them over in my hand, feeling the strange weight of what I was about to do. Installing cameras inside your own house feels different when the person you're watching shares your bed. For a second, I wondered if this was the moment I should stop. I already had enough proof of the affair from the driveway footage. I could confront them now, end the marriage, walk away with whatever dignity I could salvage from the wreckage. But then I remembered something Daniel had said a few weeks earlier during a meeting at the office. "Once the Franklin contract closes," he told me, leaning back in his chair like he had already solved every problem in the world, "the company's value is going to triple." He said it casually, like a man who expected to enjoy that future. The Franklin contract was the biggest deal our consulting firm had ever chased. If we landed it, the company would jump into an entirely different financial bracket overnight. And suddenly the timing of everything happening around me started looking less like coincidence and more like planning. That was the moment I realized something important. This might not just be an affair. It might be something much bigger. So instead of stopping, I plugged the first camera into the outlet behind the television in the living room, angled perfectly toward the couch and coffee table where most conversations happened. The second went into the outlet near the hallway that led to our bedroom. The third one I placed in the home office where I kept my financial files and work laptop. 3 quiet observers, 3 silent witnesses, all of them connected to an app on my phone that would store every second of motion they detected. By the time my wife came home from the gym that evening, everything looked exactly the same as it always had, at least to her. Over the next few days, I almost forgot the cameras were even there. Almost. But every time my phone buzzed with a motion alert while I was sitting at my desk at the office, my heart jumped slightly before I opened the app to see what had triggered it. Most of the time, it was nothing important. My wife walking through the living room, the dog from next door wandering briefly across the driveway camera. Normal things. But then 3 days later, at exactly 3:12 p.m., my phone buzzed again. Motion detected. Living room. I opened the app immediately. The video loaded. Daniel walked into the frame. He looked relaxed, comfortable, like someone who had done this many times before. A few seconds later, my wife followed him into the room carrying 2 glasses of wine. She handed him one and sat down beside him on the couch. Not across from him. Beside him. The distance between their bodies told me everything I needed to know before they even spoke. I watched the footage silently from my office while they laughed about something I couldn't hear clearly. Then Daniel leaned closer. My wife didn't move away. The kiss happened casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I should have felt something explosive in that moment. Anger, pain, anything. Instead, I just watched, because emotions would fade, but evidence would stay. The video continued for almost 40 minutes. Eventually, the 2 of them moved out of the living room frame and down the hallway toward the bedroom camera. I closed the app before that footage started playing. I didn't need to see that part. Not yet. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling of my office for a long moment, because something Daniel said near the end of that recording kept replaying in my head. My wife had been standing near the hallway, straightening her hair while he checked something on his phone. "That contract better close soon," she said with a laugh. Daniel shrugged. "It will," he replied confidently. "And when it does, everything changes." She smiled at him. "Especially for us." Daniel grinned back. "Trust me," he said. "He won't even see it coming." I sat there quietly in my office after the video ended, because suddenly the situation looked very different from what I originally thought. This wasn't just about betrayal. This was about timing, and money, and the Franklin contract, which meant there was one detail I needed to confirm before making my next move. That night, long after my wife fell asleep, I opened the camera app again and scrolled back through the recorded footage. One video after another, different days, different visits. The pattern was obvious now. Daniel had been coming to the house regularly, sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer. But the strange part wasn't how often he visited. It was what they talked about. Because halfway through one of the recordings from the previous week, I heard my wife say something that made my stomach drop. She was sitting at the dining table with a folder open in front of her. "And once the contract goes through," she said calmly, "the divorce will leave him with almost nothing." Daniel laughed. Then he said the one sentence that changed everything. "Exactly." I paused the video there, because suddenly the affair wasn't the worst part anymore. The worst part was that they weren't just betraying me. They were planning something, and I had no idea yet how far that plan went. After hearing my wife casually mention that the divorce would leave me with almost nothing, the affair itself stopped being the center of the story in my mind. Betrayal hurts, but betrayal mixed with calculation is something else entirely. That night I sat in the dark living room long after midnight with my phone in my hand, replaying the camera footage again and again while the quiet hum of the house surrounded me. Upstairs, my wife slept peacefully, completely unaware that the entire version of reality she thought she was building had already started to crumble the moment those cameras went online. At first, I told myself maybe I misunderstood what I heard. Maybe she was joking. Maybe the conversation was taken out of context. So I scrolled further through the footage. Different days, different visits, different conversations. But the pattern was impossible to ignore. Daniel and my wife weren't just meeting to sleep together. They were meeting to plan. Files appeared in several recordings, spread across the dining table while they leaned close together discussing numbers and timelines. My business partner knew every detail of our company finances. My wife knew every detail of our marriage. Together they were combining both. One clip from 4 days earlier made my chest tighten the moment it started playing. Daniel was sitting in the chair near the dining table with a glass of whiskey, while my wife flipped through a stack of papers in front of him. "These numbers still don't make sense," she said. Daniel leaned forward and pointed at one page. "They will once the Franklin deal closes," he replied calmly. "The company valuation jumps overnight." "And that's when I file?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "Exactly." My wife sat back in her chair and crossed her legs slowly. "And you're sure he won't see it coming?" Daniel laughed softly. "He trusts both of us," he said. The words hit harder than anything else I had heard that night. Because he was right. I had trusted him. Daniel and I started the consulting firm together almost a decade earlier. Back then, it was just two guys sharing a tiny rented office and arguing about client presentations over cheap takeout food. We built everything slowly from the ground up. The late nights, the early mornings, the first big client that finally made us feel like the business might survive. He had been there for every step, and now he was sitting in my dining room helping my wife plan how to take it away from me. In the recording, my wife leaned forward again. "So, once the contract closes," she said carefully, "I file for divorce and take half the company." Daniel shook his head slightly. "Not half," he corrected. "More like control." My wife raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Daniel smiled. "Think about it," he said. "You get half his shares in the divorce. I keep mine. Suddenly the two of us control the majority." For a moment the room in the recording went quiet. Then my wife slowly smiled. "And he ends up with almost nothing," she said. Daniel lifted his glass. "Exactly." I paused the video there. The silence in my living room felt heavier than anything I had experienced in a long time. Because that sentence changed everything. They weren't just planning to hurt me emotionally. They were planning to take the company I had spent 10 years building, the company that was about to explode in value once the Franklin contract closed in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. That was the ticking clock I hadn't noticed before. I leaned back on the couch and stared at the dark ceiling. Part of me wanted to storm upstairs right then and drag my wife down to the living room so she could watch the footage with me. I imagined Daniel's face when he realized the cameras had recorded everything. But anger would ruin the advantage I had. Right now, they believed I was completely unaware. Right now, they were still talking freely. And information was far more valuable than confrontation. So instead of reacting, I kept watching. More footage, more visits, more conversations. Until I reached one recording from earlier that same afternoon. In that clip, Daniel stood near the window checking his phone, while my wife walked out of the bedroom adjusting her dress. "We just need him distracted a little longer," Daniel said. "He already thinks you're working late most nights," she replied. Daniel shrugged. "Perfect." Then my wife said something that made my chest tighten again. "What about the paperwork he signed last week?" Daniel smiled. "That was the easy part." My wife laughed softly. He didn't even read it. Daniel slipped his phone into his pocket. Most people don't, he said. I paused the video again, because suddenly another memory surfaced. 2 weeks earlier, my wife had asked me to sign a refinancing document connected to the house. She said it was just routine paperwork from the bank. I barely glanced at it before signing. At the time, it felt completely normal, but now a very different thought started forming in my mind. What exactly had I signed? I stood up slowly and walked toward my home office. The folder containing that paperwork was still sitting inside my desk drawer exactly where I left it. I pulled the documents out and placed them on the desk. At first, everything looked ordinary. Mortgage details, bank language, standard legal formatting. But halfway through the paperwork, I noticed something strange. A clause referencing asset structure connected to my company shares. My stomach tightened slightly, because refinancing paperwork should have nothing to do with company ownership. I leaned closer to the page and started reading the paragraph more carefully. And the moment I understood what the clause actually meant, I felt something shift inside my chest. Because my wife and Daniel thought that document was part of their plan. But what they didn't realize was that the clause they slipped into those papers had already triggered something neither of them expected. And the person who explained exactly what that meant to me was my lawyer. The moment I finished reading the clause buried in that refinancing paperwork, I knew two things immediately. First, my wife and Daniel thought they had just secured the final piece of their plan. And second, they clearly had no idea what that clause actually did. I sat there in my home office staring at the page for several minutes, reading the same paragraph again and again, while the quiet ticking of the wall clock echoed through the room. Legal language has a way of hiding meaning inside long sentences, but once you understand the structure of it, the truth becomes very clear. And the truth sitting in front of me was almost ironic, because the document they slipped in front of me was not just refinancing paperwork. It was tied to an asset restructuring agreement, specifically an agreement involving my ownership shares in the company. At first, I wondered if maybe I misunderstood it. I wasn't a lawyer, and the language was written in that dense legal style that seems designed to confuse people on purpose. But one detail jumped out immediately. The clause referenced something called automatic asset protection triggers in the event of marital dissolution under evidence of financial conspiracy. That phrase made my stomach tighten. Financial conspiracy. I leaned back slowly in the chair, because suddenly everything started connecting. My wife had insisted we refinance the house 2 weeks earlier. She said it was just a better interest rate and that the bank needed updated signatures. I barely looked at the documents. Daniel had even stopped by that same evening and joked about how paperwork always finds a way to ruin a good night. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now it felt very different. I picked up my phone and scrolled to the one person who could answer the question sitting in my chest, my lawyer. His office opened early, so the next morning I scheduled a meeting before heading into work. I didn't mention the affair or the cameras or anything else yet. I just brought the document with me. His office smelled faintly like old books and coffee when I walked in. The walls were lined with framed certificates and shelves filled with thick legal volumes that looked like they had been sitting there since the 1980s. He adjusted his glasses and studied the document quietly for several minutes. I watched his expression carefully. At first, it stayed neutral. Then something interesting happened. He smiled. Not a big smile. Just the small kind professionals make when they notice something unusual. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "My wife had me sign it," I said. He flipped to the second page. "And you didn't draft this?" "No." He leaned back in his chair slowly. "Well," he said, tapping the paper lightly, "this is interesting." I felt my chest tighten slightly. Interesting how? He turned the document toward me and pointed to the exact clause I had been staring at the night before. "This section," he said, "is tied to a protective trust structure connected to your business shares." I frowned. "I don't remember agreeing to that." "You didn't need to," he replied calmly. "You already had a prenup clause referencing this type of protection." My mind paused for a second. "Wait," I said. So what does it actually do? He folded his hands on the desk. If your spouse attempts to claim business assets during a divorce while evidence shows financial manipulation or conspiracy involving those assets, he explained, the ownership shares automatically move into a protected trust. I blinked. And what does that mean? His smile widened slightly. It means those assets are no longer considered marital property. The words hung in the air between us. I leaned forward slowly. So she can't take half the company. He shook his head. She can't take any of it. For a moment, the room felt completely silent. Then another thought appeared. What about my partner? I asked carefully. The lawyer raised an eyebrow. What about him? I slid my phone across the desk and opened the camera footage. Daniel and my wife sitting at the dining table, discussing the company, planning the divorce, planning control. My lawyer watched the video quietly. When it ended, he leaned back in his chair again. Well, he said calmly, that certainly qualifies as conspiracy. I felt a strange calm settle into my chest, because for the first time since this entire nightmare started, the situation had shifted slightly in my favor. Daniel and my wife thought they were about to take half my life, but the moment they actually tried, they would trigger the exact clause designed to stop them. My lawyer slid the phone back toward me. You know something interesting about this situation? He said. What? He tapped the document once more. They believe this paperwork protects their plan. I nodded slowly. Yeah. He smiled again. But legally speaking, he said, it actually protects you. I sat there quietly for a moment, letting that sink in. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my mind since I first saw the footage. So, what happens if I just wait? The lawyer leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. Well, he said thoughtfully, if you wait until they make their move. He paused for a moment, then finished the sentence. They'll destroy their own case. I walked out of that office feeling something very different from anger. Patience. Because now the situation had a timeline. 6 weeks until the Franklin contract closed. 6 weeks until the company value exploded. And 6 weeks until my wife filed the divorce she thought would make her rich. The strange part was that when I got home that evening, she greeted me exactly the same way she always did. A kiss on the cheek. A casual smile. How was work? I smiled back. Busy. She laughed softly. Well, don't work too late tonight. I nodded. But later that evening, after she went upstairs to shower, my phone buzzed again with a camera alert. Daniel had just walked into my living room. And this time, he brought something with him. When the camera alert buzzed on my phone that evening, I was sitting in the kitchen pretending to read emails while my wife showered upstairs. The house was quiet except for the steady rush of water from the bathroom pipes, and for a moment I thought the notification might just be another harmless motion trigger like the dozens I had already seen over the past week. But the moment I opened the app and the video started playing, my stomach tightened immediately. Daniel had just walked into my living room. He looked more serious than usual, not relaxed like the other visits, not smiling. His jacket was still on, and he carried something thin and rectangular under his arm that looked like a leather document folder. A few seconds later, my wife walked into the frame, still tying her hair back loosely like she had just finished getting dressed after her shower. "You're early," she said. Daniel shrugged and held up the folder. "I got something you need to see." She sat down on the couch while he opened the folder and spread a stack of papers across the coffee table. From the camera angle, I couldn't read everything clearly, but one logo on the top page was instantly recognizable. The Franklin contract. My chest tightened. That deal was supposed to close in just under 5 weeks, and if everything went through the way Daniel and I expected, the company's value would triple almost overnight. We had been chasing that contract for almost a year. Now I was watching him discuss it privately with my wife in my own living room. Daniel leaned forward and tapped the document with his finger. "They're moving faster than expected," he said. My wife raised an eyebrow. "How fast?" "Possibly 3 weeks." She smiled slowly. That's perfect. Daniel nodded. Once the valuation updates, we move. My wife leaned back against the couch cushions. And he still has no idea? Daniel laughed quietly. He's the least suspicious guy I know. The sentence lingered in the room like a bad smell, because the truth was that a few weeks earlier, he probably would have been right. But now every word they spoke felt like another piece of evidence sliding neatly into place. In the footage, my wife picked up one of the pages and scanned it quickly. So, after the contract signs, she said, I file the divorce immediately? Daniel nodded. And we move the board vote right after. My heart skipped slightly at that sentence. Board vote. The company only had 4 voting members on the board. Me, Daniel, and 2 outside investors. If my wife gained half my shares during the divorce, Daniel and my wife together would control the majority vote. They wouldn't just damage me financially. They would remove me from the company completely. Daniel leaned back on the couch and stretched his arms across the backrest like the entire situation had already worked itself out. You get the shares through the divorce, he said calmly. Then we consolidate control. And him? My wife asked. Daniel shrugged. He walks away with whatever cash settlement the court gives him. She smiled. That's not much. Daniel grinned. Exactly. I sat there in the kitchen staring at the phone screen while the conversation continued. The strangest part was how casually they discussed destroying my life. Not angry, not emotional, just strategic, like they were discussing a renovation project. At one point, my wife stood up and walked toward the hallway camera. She stopped just outside the frame and glanced toward the front door like she always did before Daniel left. Then she said something that made my chest tighten again. You know, she said softly, there's one thing I'm still worried about. Daniel looked up. What? What if he finds out before the contract closes? Daniel didn't hesitate. He won't. But what if he does? She pressed. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Then we move early, he said calmly. But trust me, he's not that kind of guy. She studied him for a moment. Then she nodded. You're right. Daniel closed the folder and stood up. The conversation shifted after that. They moved closer together. Too close. My hand tightened around the phone as I watched. Because even after everything I had already seen, the physical side of their relationship still hit differently. The quiet touches, the easy familiarity. At one point, Daniel brushed a strand of hair behind her ear and kissed her. Not rushed, not secretive, just comfortable. Like they had been doing this for a long time. For a moment, the anger I had been keeping buried inside my chest flared so suddenly that I almost stood up from the kitchen chair. The urge to storm into the living room and confront them right there hit me so hard that my heart started pounding in my ears. This was my house, my marriage, my company, and they were sitting there planning how to steal all of it. I even pushed my chair back slightly before stopping myself, because the moment I confronted them, everything I had would disappear. The footage, the evidence, the legal advantage, everything. So instead I sat there and watched until Daniel finally walked toward the door. My wife followed him to the hallway. The camera caught the last thing they said before he left. Daniel opened the door and turned back toward her. 3 weeks, he said quietly. She nodded. 3 weeks. Then she smiled. And after that, everything changes. The door closed behind him. The camera kept recording as my wife walked slowly back toward the living room. For a moment she stood there alone in the frame. Then she picked up the folder Daniel left behind and flipped through the pages again. I leaned closer to the screen, because one page slid slightly sideways as she turned it. And for a brief second, the camera caught something printed at the top, a company ownership chart. My name, Daniel's name, and another name listed beside them. The name of someone who wasn't supposed to be involved in any of this. Someone who made my stomach drop the moment I read it. Because according to that document, my wife had already been promised shares in the company, before the divorce even happened. The moment I saw my wife's name listed beside mine and Daniel's on that company ownership chart, something inside me shifted in a way I hadn't expected. Up until that point, the entire situation had still felt like a terrible but simple betrayal. An affair, a conspiracy, two people trying to steal something I built. But seeing that document made it painfully clear that this wasn't a plan forming in real time. It had been moving quietly for months, maybe longer, and I had been the only person in the room who didn't realize the game had already started. I replayed that section of the footage 3 times, pausing on the frame where the paper slid just enough for the names to become visible. My name, Daniel's name, and beneath them, printed neatly in the same font as the others, the name of my wife as a future shareholder. Daniel must have already drafted the restructuring proposal for the board vote. The moment the divorce gave her half my shares, the company ownership would instantly shift. Daniel and my wife together would control the majority. I locked my phone and leaned back in the kitchen chair, staring at the dark window above the sink. Outside, the streetlight cast a dull orange glow across the driveway, where Daniel's car had been parked only minutes earlier. The silence of the house felt heavier than it ever had before. For the first time since discovering everything, a thought crossed my mind that hadn't appeared before. Maybe I should just walk away. The idea seemed ridiculous at first. Walk away from the marriage, the house, the business I spent 10 years building. But the longer I sat there, the more tempting the thought became. If I left quietly before the contract closed, I could still salvage something from the company. I could sell my shares early, disappear from the situation before their plan reached its final stage. It would be humiliating, but it would also be simple. And for a moment, simplicity sounded incredibly appealing. Upstairs, the bathroom door opened, and I heard my wife's footsteps moving across the hallway floor. I quickly set my phone face down on the table just as she walked into the kitchen wrapped in a robe, her hair still damp from the shower. "You're still up?" she asked casually. "Just finishing some work emails," I said. She poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. "Daniel said the Franklin deal might move faster than expected," she added. "Did he mention that at the office today?" The question was delivered so casually that if I hadn't just watched their entire conversation minutes earlier, I might have believed it was an innocent one. I shrugged. "He mentioned something like that." She nodded thoughtfully. "That would be great for the company." For a moment I studied her face, the same face I had woken up beside for years, the same voice that used to feel comforting when she spoke in quiet kitchens late at night like this. Now it felt like I was watching someone perform a role in a play. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Great for the company." She smiled and kissed my cheek before heading upstairs to bed. "Don't stay up too late," she said. I waited until I heard the bedroom door close before picking up my phone again, because the moment of doubt that had crept into my mind was already fading. Walking away would give them exactly what they wanted. Daniel would still control the company. My wife would still end up with a share of everything I built, and they would both believe they outplayed me. The cameras, the footage, the clause in the refinancing paperwork, all of it would become useless if I walked away now. I stood up slowly from the table and walked into the living room where Daniel had been sitting earlier. The same folder he brought with him was still on the coffee table, exactly where my wife had left it. I opened it carefully. Inside were copies of the Franklin contract projections, several internal financial reports, and the company ownership proposal I had seen on the camera footage. But something else caught my eye too. A printed timeline. 3 weeks until the contract signing. 2 weeks after that. Board vote, ownership adjustment, and one line at the very bottom. Divorce filing date. I stared at that page for a long time, because suddenly the entire plan made perfect sense. They weren't just trying to betray me. They were trying to replace me. Daniel would run the company. My wife would own part of it, and I would be pushed out of the business I created. The strange part was that the timeline they created also gave me something incredibly valuable. A countdown. 3 weeks. 3 weeks before the Franklin deal closed. 3 weeks before the divorce. 3 weeks before they tried to take everything from me. I closed the folder and placed it back exactly where I found it. Then I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app again, not to watch the old footage, to check something new, because while I had been sitting in the kitchen debating whether to walk away, another motion alert had appeared on the screen, this time from the home office camera. I tapped the video. The footage loaded instantly. Daniel was standing inside my office, alone, and he was opening the drawer where I kept the company financial records. But what he pulled out of that drawer wasn't paperwork. It was something he clearly wasn't expecting to find. When the footage from the home office camera started playing, the first thing I noticed was how comfortable Daniel looked standing inside that room, like someone who had already mentally claimed the space as his own. He closed the office door behind him slowly and walked toward my desk without any hesitation, which told me something important immediately. This wasn't curiosity. This was part of their plan. I leaned closer to the phone screen while the video continued. Daniel opened the top drawer of my desk and began flipping through the folders inside with calm efficiency, the way someone does when they already know what they're looking for. A few seconds later, he pulled out the blue folder that held our company financial reports and set it on the desk. My chest tightened slightly, because if he took that folder, he would have access to internal projections and account structures he didn't need to see outside the office. But then, something unexpected happened. As Daniel opened the drawer further, his hand brushed against a small black device sitting in the corner. He froze. Slowly, he picked it up. The camera. For a moment, he stared at it like he couldn't quite process what he was holding. I held my breath, because if he realized what it was, everything would fall apart instantly. Daniel turned the device over in his hand, examined the plug, pressed the small button on the side. Then he frowned. "Security upgrade?" he muttered to himself. He shrugged and set the camera back down exactly where he found it. The moment he turned away, I finally exhaled, because he hadn't recognized it. He thought it was just part of the house security system. And that mistake told me something very important. Daniel believed he was already in control. People who believe they've already won rarely look closely at the details. He returned to the drawer and pulled out several documents before closing it again. Then he opened the folder he brought with him earlier and compared the numbers briefly. A few seconds later, my wife stepped into the office. "You found them?" she asked quietly. Daniel nodded. "Yeah." He handed her one of the papers. "These are the numbers the board will see after the Franklin contract closes." She glanced down at the page. "And after the divorce?" Daniel leaned against the desk. "After the divorce," he said calmly, "your shares plus mine equal 52%. My wife smiled slowly. "So we control the vote." "Exactly." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then my wife said something that made my stomach tighten again. "You're sure the asset paperwork won't cause problems?" Daniel laughed. "He signed it himself." She nodded. "Good." Daniel slid the financial reports back into the drawer and closed it carefully. "He really should start reading what he signs," he said. I paused the video, because that sentence made something click inside my head. Daniel and my wife believed that refinancing document gave them control. They thought it allowed my wife to claim my company shares in the divorce. But what they didn't understand was that the clause inside that document did the exact opposite. The moment they tried to take the shares through a divorce tied to financial conspiracy, those shares would automatically move into the protected trust, my lawyer explained, which meant the plan they believed would give them control of the company would actually erase my wife's claim completely. And Daniel would lose the majority vote he thought he had already secured. They had built their entire strategy on a misunderstanding. I leaned back slowly on the couch while the realization settled into place, because the truth was something even more ironic. The moment they filed the divorce and tried to take my shares, they would activate the exact protection designed to stop them, and the evidence from the cameras would prove everything: the affair, the conspiracy, the plan to manipulate company ownership, all of it. I reopened the video and watched the final part of the recording. Daniel closed the office drawer and walked toward the door. My wife followed him into the hallway. 3 weeks, Daniel said again. She nodded. 3 weeks. Then she added something that made me smile for the first time since this entire nightmare started. I almost feel bad for him, she said. Daniel laughed. Don't. The door closed behind them. I sat there quietly in the living room for a long moment after the video ended, because the situation had finally flipped completely. 3 weeks ago, I was the one in the dark. Now they were. Daniel thought he was about to take control of the company. My wife thought she was about to walk away with half of everything I owned. But the truth was much simpler. The moment they made their move, they would destroy their own plan. I stood up and walked into my office. Opened the same desk drawer Daniel had just searched. Inside was something else he never noticed. A second folder, one that contained copies of the camera recordings, copies of the financial restructuring agreement, and a document my lawyer prepared earlier that afternoon, a legal notice ready to be delivered the moment the Franklin contract closed. The timing mattered, because the contract signing event would bring everyone together, the investors, the board, Daniel, and my wife. Which meant when the truth came out, everyone who mattered would be in the same room. I closed the drawer and turned off the office light, because now the only thing left to do was wait. 3 weeks. 3 weeks until the deal closed. 3 weeks until they made their move. 3 weeks until they realized something was very wrong. But what they didn't know yet was that someone else had already made a phone call earlier that day. And that call meant the Franklin contract meeting was about to become something very different. 3 weeks passed faster than I expected, which was strange considering how slowly time seemed to move during the first few days after discovering everything. Once the plan was in motion, though, the waiting stopped feeling like torture and started feeling like preparation. Every conversation with Daniel at the office felt different now. I watched him explain numbers to clients, watched him laugh with investors, watched him act like the same partner I had trusted for nearly a decade. The difference was that now I understood the performance. The Franklin contract signing was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in one of the conference halls downtown. It was supposed to be a celebration, the biggest deal our company had ever secured. Investors, board members, and senior staff were all invited. Daniel spent the entire week talking about how this moment would change everything for us. The irony of that statement stayed with me, because for him, it absolutely would. On the morning of the event, my wife kissed me goodbye before leaving the house. "You must be excited today," she said while pouring coffee. "Big day for the company." I nodded. "Yeah," I said. "It is." She smiled, but there was something slightly different in her expression. Anticipation. Like someone counting down to something they believed was about to go perfectly. What she didn't know was that I had already met with my lawyer again 2 days earlier. And that phone call I made back in Chapter 9? That call had gone to one of our board investors, because if the truth was going to come out, I wanted every person who mattered in the same room. The conference hall buzzed with conversation when I arrived that afternoon. People were shaking hands, glasses of champagne moving between small clusters of executives, while the presentation screen displayed the Franklin contract logo behind the stage. Daniel spotted me immediately and walked over with a grin. "This is it," he said, clapping my shoulder. "The moment everything changes." I smiled back at him. "Yeah," I said quietly. "It really is." The presentation started 15 minutes later. Daniel walked onto the stage and delivered the speech we had rehearsed together weeks earlier. The story of how the company started, the growth, the future. He spoke confidently, like a man who believed he was about to step into the most successful chapter of his career. When he finished, the room applauded. The Franklin representatives signed the contract. Cameras flashed, champagne glasses lifted, and right on schedule, Daniel stepped forward again. "There's one more item we'd like to address," he said, glancing briefly toward me. The board members leaned forward slightly. Daniel continued. "With the company entering a new stage of growth, we've prepared an ownership restructuring proposal." He looked toward the audience. My wife was standing near the back of the room, watching, waiting. Daniel opened the folder and began explaining the plan. the transfer of shares, the board vote, the new majority structure. He finished the explanation with a confident smile. This adjustment positions the company perfectly for the future. One of the investors cleared his throat. And the divorce filing connected to this proposal? The question landed like a dropped glass. Daniel froze. My wife's expression shifted instantly. Daniel glanced toward me. "What divorce?" he said carefully. The investor slid a tablet across the table. On the screen was the footage, the living room camera, Daniel and my wife discussing the plan, the ownership control, the divorce timing. The entire room went silent. Daniel's face turned pale. My wife looked at me like she had just realized something terrible. "You recorded us?" she whispered. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "You plan to take the company," I said calmly. "You just forgot one detail." Daniel tried to recover. "You can't prove anything with—" My lawyer stepped forward before he could finish. "Actually," he said politely, placing a document on the table, "the evidence is quite clear." He tapped the paper. "And thanks to the clause triggered in the refinancing paperwork your client signed." He paused slightly. "Those company shares are no longer marital property." My wife stared at the document. "What does that mean?" My lawyer smiled slightly. "It means you get none of it." Daniel looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under him. "You can't do that," he said. But the board investors were already whispering among themselves. One of them stood up. "Daniel," he said quietly, "we're going to have to ask you to step down immediately." Security escorted him out 10 minutes later. My wife left before anyone even asked her to. The divorce filing came the following week. Without the company shares, the financial outcome looked very different from what she expected. Months later, the company was stronger than ever. The Franklin deal turned out even bigger than the projections suggested. We hired new leadership, expanded into 2 new markets, and moved into a larger office building downtown. Sometimes people ask me when I first realized something was wrong in my marriage. I usually tell them it started with a strange smell in the hallway one evening. But the truth is simpler than that. The moment everything really began was the day I pretended to leave for a business trip. I sat in my car 2 blocks from my own house, watching the garage door. And when it opened, I finally saw the truth walking out of it. What Daniel and my wife never understood was that they thought they were playing a long game. They just didn't realize I had already come back 2 hours early.